On the morning of August 8, 1977, officials at the state bank in Yerevan walked into a vault that had been emptied of 1.5 million rubles, a sum so staggering it could have purchased a fleet of luxury vehicles reserved only for the Soviet elite. The robber had entered through a break room window on the second floor, dropped through a hole he'd punched in the floorboards, and vanished into the Armenian summer night with enough cash to destabilize regional monetary flow. How does a single man carry out the largest bank heist in Soviet history inside a system built on surveillance, denunciation, and the assumption that crime on this scale was a capitalist disease? The Soviet Union in the late 1970s was a place of peculiar contradictions. Store shelves stood half empty, while officials drove Volgas and Chaikas that cost 10,000 rubles apiece, vehicles so expensive they represented 3 years of an engineer's salary. Ordinary citizens queued for hours to buy sausage or fabric, yet the apparatus of state control reached into every apartment block, every workplace, every corner of public life. The KGB maintained files on millions. Neighbors reported neighbors. The idea that someone could steal the equivalent of 150 luxury cars from a state bank, the very symbol of Soviet financial power, seemed impossible. But Felix Kalachyan was not an ordinary citizen, and his plan did not rely on force or stealth alone. It relied on a flaw in the system itself, the flaw of human ambition operating inside a structure that claimed to have eliminated greed. Felix and his cousin Nikolai had been planning the robbery for months, and they had an advantage most criminals could only dream of: an inside man. Zaven Baghdasaryan worked at the state bank in Yerevan, and he had access to something more valuable than keys or alarm codes. He had information. He knew when the vault would be fullest. He knew the routines of the guards, he knew which walls were thickest and which rooms were left unmonitored on weekends. In a society where information was the most tightly controlled commodity, Baghdasaryan was offering a blueprint. The Kalachyan cousins were not ideological dissidents or black marketeers with international connections. They were locals, ambitious men who had grown up watching the gap between propaganda and reality widen with every 5-year plan. They saw the dacha privileges of party bosses, the under-the-table payments that greased every transaction, the way Soviet law applied differently depending on who you knew. If the system was already corrupt, they reasoned, why not take a piece for themselves? If you're watching this because you want to understand how people actually navigated Soviet power, how the mechanics of control created the very opportunities for subversion, consider subscribing. This channel exists to dig into the decisions, the risks, and the human calculations behind Cold War history that official records tried to bury. The plan was simple in concept, but required precision in execution. The cousins would break into the bank on a weekend when staff were gone and security was lightest. Felix, a candidate for Master of Sports in artistic gymnastics, would handle the physical side. His training meant he could climb, balance, and maneuver through spaces that would stop an average man. Nikolai would provide support and logistics. Baghdasaryan would ensure they had the intelligence they needed. It was a 3-man operation in a country where conspiracies of more than 2 people usually ended in denunciation. Trust was the rarest currency in the Soviet Union, and the Kalachians were betting their lives on it. But a week before the scheduled robbery, Nikolai was hospitalized. The details of his illness are not entirely clear from the surviving records, but the timing was catastrophic. Felix faced a choice: abort the plan and wait for his cousin to recover, or go ahead alone. Delay meant more time for something to go wrong, more chances for Baghdasaryan to get cold feet, or for surveillance to notice the unusual interest the cousins had been showing in the area around the bank. Felix decided to act. On the evening of Saturday, August 5, 1977, he moved into position. He started by breaking into an apartment building adjacent to the bank. The building was empty that weekend, its residents away or simply absent in the way that Soviet housing often left units unoccupied for weeks during summer months. Felix's first plan was to break through the wall that separated the apartment from the bank's vault. He carried tools, a hammer and chisel, possibly a small pry bar. He began to work on the wall, but the construction was thicker than expected, reinforced in a way that Baghdasaryan either had not known about or had failed to communicate. Hours of effort produced only a shallow dent. The wall would not give. Felix was running out of time. Dawn would come, and with it the risk of discovery. He changed tactics. Instead of going through the wall, he would go over it. He climbed onto the roof of the apartment building and surveyed the bank. The rooftops in that part of Yerevan were close together, typical of Soviet urban planning where space was maximized and aesthetics were secondary. He made his way across to the bank's roof. There, he found something Baghdasaryan had mentioned in passing, a break room on the second floor. and one of the windows had been left open. It was a small oversight, the kind of human error that no amount of state planning could eliminate. A bank employee, perhaps stifled by the August heat, had cracked the window for air and forgotten to close it before leaving for the weekend. Felix squeezed through. Inside, the break room was dim and quiet, smelling of stale tobacco and tea. He was inside the state bank of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic alone. Now came the hardest part. The vault was below him on the ground floor. He could not use the stairs without risking exposure to any cameras or motion sensors that might be active. So he did what his years of gymnastics training had prepared him for. He punched a hole in the floor. The Soviet construction of the era was often sturdy in appearance but shoddy in execution, built by workers meeting quotas rather than quality standards. The floorboards gave way. Felix widened the hole, tied a rope to a structural beam, and lowered himself down into the darkness. He landed in a corridor near the vault. The vault itself was not as heavily secured as a Western bank's might have been, because the Soviet ideology held that crime was a symptom of capitalism, not socialism. Who would rob a people's bank? The locks were mechanical, the alarm system basic. Baghdasaryan had provided details on how to bypass or disable what little security existed. Felix moved quickly. Inside the vault, stacks of rubles were organized by denomination, bundled and labeled for transfer to regional branches and state enterprises. He took 1.5 million rubles. The cash was heavy, but not unmanageable. He stuffed it into bags, slung them over his shoulders, and retraced his steps. Back up the rope, through the break room, onto the roof, across to the apartment building, and out into the Yerevan night. By the time the theft was discovered on Monday morning, Felix and Nikolai were gone. The immediate reaction inside the bank was confusion, then panic. 1.5 million rubles was not just money. It was a political catastrophe. The state bank was an organ of Soviet power, a symbol of centralized control over the economy. To admit that it had been robbed was to admit that the system had failed. Officials faced a dilemma: report the theft and risk accusations of negligence, or cover it up and hope the money could be recovered quietly. The decision was made to investigate aggressively, but to keep the details out of the press. The KGB was brought in. The Kalachyan cousins did not head for the border or try to disappear into the vast Soviet hinterland. Instead, they went straight to Moscow. This choice reveals something crucial about their mindset. They were not trying to escape the Soviet Union. They were trying to escape their class. With 600,000 rubles, they believed they could buy their way into a different life. In Moscow, they began to spend. They bought goods that were unavailable in Yerevan, luxury items that signaled status: watches, foreign cigarettes, tailored clothes. They frequented restaurants that required connections or bribes to enter. They moved through the capital with the confidence of men who had money in a system where money, though officially secondary to ideology, opened every door. But the Soviet system, for all its inefficiencies, had one area of competence: surveillance. The KGB tracked rubles. Large denominations were noted. Spending patterns were monitored. The Kalachains were not experienced criminals. They did not understand the invisible tripwires they were crossing with every transaction. When they attempted to purchase securities worth a large sum, something that required official documentation and verification, they tripped the final alarm. A bank employee in Moscow, trained to watch for irregularities, remembered their description and their car. The details matched an alert that had been circulated quietly among financial institutions. On June 7, 1978, 10 months after the robbery, Felix and Nikolai Kalachyan were arrested. The investigation moved quickly once they were in custody. Under interrogation, the cousins gave up Zaven Baghdasaryan. There was no culture of silence among Soviet criminals, no code that bound them. The KGB used psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and the promise of leniency to extract confessions. Baghdasaryan was arrested within days. The trial was conducted behind closed doors, as were most cases involving crimes that embarrassed the state. The details were not published in Pravda or broadcast on Soviet television. The public narrative remained that socialism had no need for bank security because socialism had eliminated the motives for crime. Baghdasaryan, the insider, received 11 years in a maximum security prison. His sentence reflected the Soviet view that betrayal of trust within the state apparatus was among the gravest offenses. He had not only stolen money, he had exposed the vulnerabilities of an institution meant to project strength. The Kalachyan cousins faced a harsher judgment. Both were sentenced to death. Execution was the standard penalty for crimes of this magnitude. Crimes that threatened state stability or involved large-scale theft of socialist property. The sentences were pronounced in Yerevan. The condemned men were held in a detention facility awaiting the final formalities. But in Moscow, something unexpected happened. The Supreme Soviet of the USSR reviewed the case and decided to commute the death sentences to long-term imprisonment. The reasons are not entirely clear from available records. Perhaps officials concluded that executions would draw more attention to a case they wanted forgotten. Perhaps there was a bureaucratic preference for labor camp sentences, which fed the Gulag system with workers. Whatever the motive, the decision was made. A message was sent from Moscow to Yerevan instructing authorities to halt the executions and transfer the prisoners to labor camps. The message did not arrive in time. On the morning the commutation order was being transmitted, Felix and Nikolai Kalachyan were taken from their cells and executed by firing squad. The procedure was swift and procedural, conducted according to the regulations that governed capital punishment in the Soviet Union. Only afterward did officials in Yerevan receive the order from Moscow. The executions had been carried out minutes or hours before the reversal arrived. There was no mechanism to undo what had been done. The bureaucracy that prided itself on control had failed at the most critical moment. 2 men were dead because a piece of paper traveled too slowly. The aftermath was buried in silence. No official acknowledgement was made of the error. Baghdasaryan served his sentence in the labor camps of the Soviet East, released eventually into a country that no longer existed. The state bank in Yerevan returned to business as usual, its vault repaired, its procedures quietly updated. The money was never fully recovered. Some of it had been spent, some of it disappeared into the black market networks that ran parallel to the official Soviet economy, and some of it may have been quietly pocketed by officials during the investigation. In a system where theft was endemic at every level, from factory managers falsifying output reports to party secretaries skimming construction budgets, the missing rubles were just another line item in an economy built on lies. The Kalachyan heist became a legend in Yerevan, whispered about in kitchens and communal apartments, but never discussed openly. It was proof that the system could be beaten, that the state was not as omnipotent as it claimed. For some, Felix Kalachyan was a hero, a man who took what the party bosses took every day but were never punished for. For others, he was a fool who threw his life away for money he could never safely spend. Both views were correct. The heist succeeded because the Soviet system created the conditions for it: underpaid employees like Baghdasaryan, gaps in security born of ideological denial, and a culture where corruption was normalized at the top. But it also failed because the same system could mobilize total surveillance and ruthless punishment when its symbols were threatened. The execution that came too late is the detail that haunts the story. It was not a decision made by evil men, but by a bureaucracy that valued procedure over human life. The officials who carried out the execution were following orders. The officials who sent the commutation order believed they were showing mercy. Neither side communicated effectively. The result was death by paperwork, a uniquely Soviet tragedy. In the West, such a failure might have triggered investigations, resignations, public outcry. In the Soviet Union, it was absorbed into the silence that surrounded all uncomfortable truths. The families of the Kalachyan cousins were not compensated. No one was held accountable. The system continued. Decades later, after the Soviet Union collapsed, some records were opened and some stories were told. The Kalachyan heist emerged as a footnote in the history of Soviet crime, a case study in the gap between propaganda and reality. Researchers found references to it in KGB archives, in court documents that had been classified, in the memories of people who had lived in Yerevan during those years. The details were fragmentary, but the outlines were clear. The largest bank heist in Soviet history was not carried out by a sophisticated criminal network or foreign saboteurs. It was carried out by a gymnast and his cousin, with help from a bank employee who wanted more than the state was willing to give him. The story forces a question that applies far beyond one robbery in one city in one year. What happens when a system denies human nature, when it insists that people can be made into new socialist men and women who do not desire status or wealth or escape? The Soviet Union built an entire civilization on that premise. It collapsed not because of military defeat or foreign subversion, but because the premise was false. People like Felix Kalachyan, Zaven Baghdasaryan, and Nikolai Kalachyan were not aberrations. They were the system's products, shaped by its contradictions and driven to exploit the gaps between what it promised and what it delivered. Their heist succeeded because the state had grown complacent, convinced by its own propaganda that crime was impossible under socialism. Their capture was inevitable because the state, for all its failures, retained the machinery of control and the will to use it without mercy. The execution that arrived too late is the perfect symbol of Soviet dysfunction. A government that could plan 5-year plans and launch cosmonauts, but could not get a message across its own capital in time to save 2 lives. It is a reminder that systems, no matter how powerful, are made of people, and people make mistakes. The difference is that in some systems, mistakes are acknowledged and corrected. In others, they are hidden, and the consequences are borne by those with no power to resist. Felix and Nikolai Kalachyan died because they tried to beat a system that could not admit it was beatable. Their deaths were recorded in a ledger somewhere, filed away, and forgotten by everyone except those who remembered that in the summer of 1977, someone walked into a state bank and walked out with the impossible.